Meanwhile, the U.S., the EU, and NATO lay full responsibility on the Ukrainian government, threatening it with consequences and sanctions. Individual sanctions for 20 Ukrainian politicians have already been imposed by Washington. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said that the action of the Western states resembles blackmail, and he urged condemnation of these actions of, quote, radicals and extremists who are mostly responsible for violence and bloody riots. Joining me now to discuss the bigger picture is Brian Becker. He's the national coordinator of the Answer Coalition. Now, Brian, as I had alluded to earlier, they are imposing sanctions at the moment. European Western leaders are. How do you feel that that will play a role? Will it actually curb the violence as the West seems to think it will?
Well, we have to look at the new sanctions measures in a bigger context. The United States and the EU, the NATO powers, have been using all kinds of pressure on the Ukraine government with the effort to bring the Ukraine into the EU, which means to bring it into NATO, right on Russia's border. And in November, what they did is they gave an ultimatum to the Ukraine government. You either make a decision now, be with Russia, or be with the EU, no other choice. Then they outlined a plan, which was to impose extreme austerity measures on the Ukrainian people as part of the admission policy to get into the EU. Then, of course, they helped castigate or create these protests. And now, as the protesters are using extreme violence, as the government is using violence, and as the government is trying to maintain order, the U.S. and the EU say, now we will impose sanctions on the Yevtushenko government for the use of violence. So this is a full court press. This is pressure. What's the real purpose? I think it's to break up the Ukraine government with the hopefully weakening that government, toppling that government, and getting a government that will take the country into the EU, into the Western sphere of influence. And this has to be seen by Russia as a great threat.
So you kind of laid out one scenario there, but I want to talk to you about best and worst case scenarios. What do they look like to you in this country?
Well, the worst case scenario is that Ukraine, which is divided, of course, between East and West, and there's a class divide between rich and poor, between those who look to the East and those who have been sort of taken towards the West, or the upper crust of the western part of the country who look towards Germany. The worst case could be that Ukraine could descend into real civil war, that there could be the dismemberment of Ukraine, a country of 46 million people, a beautiful country with a rich history. That's what happened to Yugoslavia under pressure from NATO forces. It was a country that was a multinational, multi-ethnic, regionally divided multinational republic. It was broken up. Could this happen to the Ukraine? Yes. The same thing happened to the former Soviet Union. Under those circumstances, the worst-case scenario could be so much suffering, not just for now, not just for months or years, but for generations for the people of the Ukraine. Best case, the EU and the United States should get out of the Ukraine and let the Ukrainian people become the masters of their own destiny. That's the best case.
Now, that is a really slippery slope to civil war, but I want to know from you, I mean, we're seeing people die on a daily basis. We're seeing these clashes continue for weeks and months. Where is that line when it comes to a revolution, when that starts happening, or when we start calling this a civil war? When is that line?
Well, we're getting close to that line. I don't think it's a revolution. I think it's kind of a counter-revolution. We've seen the era of counter-revolution for the last 20 years where Western powers who have vast economic, military, and diplomatic authority, especially since the collapse of the Soviet Union, are picking apart the former Soviet republics, integrating them into an American or Western sphere of influence, integrating them into NATO. And that's part of a counter-revolution because it's not really for the benefit of the people. The Western powers will always say we're doing it for a noble cause, freedom, democracy, against repression, but they have their own imperial interests in this very important, geostrategically important, and resource-rich part of the world.
And Brian, you're kind of speaking of the U.S. as a whole. I want to focus on some of the individual players that are obviously taking part in this. A number of American politicians have been very vocal about it, some of them even visiting. I'm talking about John McCain. He visited back in December, excuse me, and U.S. Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland actually handed out pastries in Independence Square. So talk about the involvement of individual American politicians in how this whole thing plays out.
Well, John McCain is a provocateur and a war maker. He's assigned to himself the role of destabilizing and overthrowing governments or always advocating war. I mean, he is the ultra-militarist there. But you know that this is, as you mentioned, a bipartisan affair because the sector, when I talk about the U.S., I'm not talking about the American people. I'm talking about the main U.S. foreign policy establishment, which is linked to the military, linked to the CIA, linked to big oil, to the NSA, that whole military-industrial complex. What they're trying to do is destabilize the Ukraine, not because they care about Ukrainian people. They want to incorporate Ukraine, this important country, big country, the second largest army and military in Europe. They want to incorporate it as part of the U.S. sphere of influence. That's an imperial design. The American people don't gain anything from that, but big corporations and banks and the military-industrial complex, they do gain.
Very interesting perspective on what is no doubt a very complex scene. Thank you so much for weighing in. Brian Becker, National Coordinator at the Answer Coalition.